The wind blew from the horizon. Sometimes a ray of light illuminated the water flowing among the steppe. It had not stopped raining for 2 days, and yet we hoped that it would continue for as long. If we continued to make 50 kilometers a day, we would reach the Dnieper in a couple of days. No airplanes flew in such disgusting weather. A day without yaks meant salvation for several hundred people. In this part of Russia, the Wehrmacht was deprived of the most important source of its power, mobility. The men of Army Group Center dragged along at no more than 5 kilometers per hour. The mobility that had given us an advantage over the huge but slow Soviet formations was now a memory. Moreover, the Red Army's armament was becoming more and more modern. We found ourselves face to face with extremely mobile motorized regiments of fresh units. To top it all off, the Russians, who had liberated themselves at Konotop, could now pursue us as we slowly retreated. German aviation, busy in the south, gave our part of the sky to the yaks. Those did not fail to seize the opportunity and attacked us, taking advantage of their numerical advantage. That is why, in spite of heavy clothes soaked with water, worn-out boots, fever, inability to sleep, we thanked fate for the downpour. In the morning 5 Bolshevik airplanes appeared, which were not hindered by the weather. Our soldiers reacted as anyone who wants to save his life should. They began to look for shelter in the flat valley. But, like trapped animals, we realized that there was no way out. The companies in the immediate line of fire threw themselves down as the instructions dictated. Several men were blown to pieces, but nevertheless one plane was shot down. However, we were not lucky. This plane fell directly on our transport, hitting the truck with the wounded and forming a crater 20 meters wide. No one screamed. Most of us didn't even look in that direction. We picked up our duffel bags and continued on our way. We had seen too much. For me, for example, life has lost all meaning. Of course, friendship remains. There's Gals and Paula. Behind them is a vortex with entrails, blood, disgusting odor. You can die in a second, but someone else's guts stay in your memory for a long time. We walked without stopping. We still couldn't see the Dnieper. We expected to reach the river in 5 days, but it was already the 6th. We could walk no more than 30 kilometers on this mud. I had never seen such a vast and empty space before. The trucks that had filled up with gasoline had long since overtaken us. The same cars, which did not have enough gasoline, were pulled by barely alive horses from among those we had not yet had time to eat. From time to time, someone would get off the car, pulled by the 2 nags, and continue on foot. We were ordered not to abandon the equipment under any circumstances. They promised to bring fuel, but we don't know how. Maybe by air, then we could refuel the cars. And indeed, one morning airplanes brought us supplies. 2 Junkers 524s dropped 8 big bundles of rope. They could have been used to tie the cars to the tanks, but the tanks were destroyed a week ago near Konotop. 2 horses were pulling our truck, on which I put all my weapons. These horses were taken a year ago from field work. One of them was covered with sores, its eyes glistened feverishly. 2 days later, at the Dnieper, the brave horse received his reward. A cavalry field officer shot him along with 10 others. It was impossible to leave something that could be used by the Russians. So we began to apply the tactic of scorched earth. The ratio of healthy to sick became threatening. Our commanders never tired of repeating. A healthy body has a healthy spirit. But in the conditions of retreat, it was difficult to say what suffered earlier, the spirit or the body. More than half of the soldiers had both. Fortunately, the weather continued to be nasty. The sick, especially those with fever, had a hard time. They lacked food and water. Their wounds were covered with mud and rags hanging from them. But better wind, rain, and heavy clouds than clear skies and airplanes. We, paying no attention to anything, continued our slow journey. 2 or 3 times a day, cover squads passed us. They were supposed to delay the enemy, who, however, did not pursue us too actively. We knew that we could say goodbye to the cover forever. Russian armored corps were massacring entire regiments. Retreat was costing us dearly. And on the eastern bank of the Dnieper, it took the most lives. There were so many people and equipment, and the sand was so flat that any shell sent by the Russians caused maximum damage. Those who had a healthy spirit in a healthy body might have figured out how to avoid the worst of it, but we had no such people. Eyes accustomed to seeing all sorts of things still widened in surprise. Every soldier who reached the border of the safe zone, the bank of the Dnieper, found himself in a state of incredible panic, and immediately learned that it was necessary to push the other soldiers even to sink them to fit into the ships, which often sank before reaching the opposite shore. On the 8th day of the journey, after overcoming a huge hill, we finally reached the bank of the river, or rather the huge number of infantrymen standing on the bank. There was swearing and bickering everywhere. There was also the sound of engines, which lifted our spirits. If the engines were running, there must be... We knew that in such a huge country you can't do without transportation, but even with it you can't get very far because of the terrible roads. But since we could hear engines, at least some reorganization had begun. In the crowd one could see many vehicles that the soldiers, despite all the difficulties, had managed to drag to the river. But it was the noise of engines, not of trucks, but of motorboats. However, they were clearly not enough. The boats were used to transport both men and machines. Equipment was favoured. It was not easy to load cars, guns and light tanks on boats designed to carry hay carts. Fortunately, there were more than enough men to replace the harbour cranes. Even at the place where we arrived there were at least 1,000 of them. The soldiers stood up to their necks in the water, holding the planks from which the loading was done until the water reached their chins. They had to fight against time. It was not until 2 days after our arrival, when all possible equipment had been moved to the other side of the river, that the crossing of the 5 divisions began. We had at our disposal 10 vessels, each of which could hold no more than 20 men, and 4 barges. These were dragged by 2 small boats, fitted with a portable engine. In addition, there were 2 other strange pontoons, each with a capacity of 150 men. At this point south of Kiev, the Dnieper reaches a width of 800 meters. If we had chosen the area north of Kiev for the crossing, we would have found ourselves in a densely populated area, where boats would surely have been available, and the river there narrows down to 100 meters, and there were bridges left in Kiev itself. By the evening of the 3rd day, after our arrival, 10,000 people had already gathered on the western bank of the Dnieper. The first to be sent were the sick and wounded. Often those who were slightly wounded gave way to those who could no longer walk. Despite the downpour and the monotonous diet of horse meat, often raw, we took advantage of the enforced delay to rest. On the 3rd or 4th day things became hell again. As soon as the rain ended, we heard the rumblings of war, at first barely audible, poorly discernible, and then clear. Tanks were moving toward us through the mud. The mere rumbling was enough to cause terror among the 85,000 trapped soldiers. Everyone raised their heads and listened intently. We peered into the darkness and tried to see what could not be seen. Then there were shouts everywhere. No. Tanks. We grabbed our packs and ran to the river. Suddenly the boats were not too far away and we would be able to get in. Screams of terror echoed over the river. Many people threw their belongings and threw themselves into the water, hoping to swim to the opposite bank. There were cries for help. The madness spread like wildfire. I was almost unconscious from fatigue. With 5 or 6 soldiers, we sat on a mountain of sacks, thrown on the wet grass, and watched the howling mob rush past us. The officers, who had some self-control, with the help of the soldiers who still knew what was going on, tried to rouse the crowd like shepherds to a maddened flock. They succeeded in organizing several detachments. They placed them on the slopes of the hill. The soldiers were supposed to stop the Soviet tanks. The soldiers stretched out in a chain along the river bank to save as many lives as possible. An hour and a half later, the T-34s appeared. There weren't many of them. They were heading toward Kiev, where intense fighting was going on. I stayed where I was when a rumor spread that they had made a raft out of tires, and perhaps a few soldiers could swim across to the west bank on it. We ran a few 100 meters and saw at least 100 soldiers by the water. Several men were taking tires off cars and making a raft out of them. They did not look at us in a friendly way. Finally, a big man said, "You see, you can't fit half of us on this thing. Go on ahead and see what you can find." He said the same thing to those who had come earlier, but most still stayed, hoping to force their way onto the raft if necessary. But that's not for me. And this raft is going to sink anyway. I went up the river in the company of 2 artillerymen who had fallen behind their units. We waded through a thick fog. There were frightened soldiers everywhere on the bank. The fog grew denser and denser, and at last it became completely dark. We could no longer see where we were going. Every now and then someone would check where the river was and shout into the dark, "The water's over there." And so we walked on, not thinking about anything. And if we had gone further, we would have found ourselves near Kiev, where bloody battles were being fought. But we lost the ability to think logically. Fear of tanks forced us to go forward, just to save ourselves. It didn't matter where, just to get far. From time to time there were flashes in the darkness, the rumble of guns. A platoon passed close by. There were no people in sight, but voices were heard. "Look out, the Ivans are coming." I looked questioningly at the artilleryman, who had been walking beside me for half an hour, but he looked only forward, like a hunted animal. We had lost the ability to understand what was happening. We thought that the Russians were on the right, behind the hills. But the shooting was coming from the left, Now all that was left was to find some shelter. Finally, we crammed ourselves into the bottom of a dried-up pond and tried to make sense of the situation. One of my companions said that the Russians in small detachments ride in boats and shoot the Germans. Judging by the flashes that were visible at a distance of several hundred meters, there were indeed quite a few boats. Shells were flying from the west. They were bursting to the east, behind the hills. This reassured us. They must be our shells. I always recognized their sound. "I didn't think they would come to our aid," said another soldier who had just joined us. The shelling lasted only 10 minutes and would hardly have been successful, for they were shooting at random. The fog had become so dense that the flashes of the 77mm guns were almost invisible. It seemed as if we were looking through a translucent cloth. The air was getting colder and colder. God, it was cold. The water, which reached us to the middle of our boots, was almost freezing. Our boots were soaked with water and our feet were freezing. "We can't go on like this," said the artilleryman. "We must get out of here, or we will not last long. And why should we be afraid of our own guns?" Each boot weighed at least a ton. The fatigue, which never left us for a moment, only made us more afraid. We had learned, like cats, to see in the dark, but the keenest eye could not penetrate through the fog, which was like thick pea soup. My nose was so blocked that I could only breathe through my mouth. I pressed my lips tightly together so that only the air necessary to keep me alive would get through. We emerged from the ravine and walked as if in a mixture of water and sulphur. Everything inside burned. I remembered the advice the veteran had given me, but nothing came to mind. Then I began to think of all the good things that had happened to me a long time ago. But that was impossible. All kinds of crap came into my head. The backs of the soldiers reminded me of my mother's back, busy with something on a long winter's evening, or my brother's back, or someone else I had known before the war. I saw Russia, and it could not be drowned out by the memories of my youth. The war will leave a mark on all of us for the rest of our lives. We'll forget women, money, happiness, but we can't forget the war. Even the coming joy, such as the anticipation of victory, cannot drown it out. There is something unnatural in the laughter of those who have gone through war, some despair. It is useless to tell them that they must learn from their experiences. They have had a hard time, and something has broken inside them. For them, laughter is no better than tears. I wanted to give the soldier in front of me a good crack. Let him fall. Then he would be on the same level as the war. But there would be the back of the soldier on the right, and thousands more backs like that, peeping out from behind the acrid fog. Russia is full of ours, and it will take more than one battle before they all fall. The rumble of the guns grew louder and louder, like the sound of an approaching train. The crackle of machine gun fire was also heard. True, nothing could be seen yet. We also heard shouts, drowned out by the rumble of guns and tanks. We froze in place. From the mouth of each of us there was a light smoke. On the faces of my comrades I tried to read at least some explanation of what was happening, but I saw only fear. There must have been written on my face. The memories did not help at all. Knowing that only trouble awaited us, we immediately began to look for shelter. Nothing but the high bank of the river. I plunged into the water up to my thighs. After the icy air, the water felt even warmer. I immediately stopped remembering about anything, and only looked at the black wall, which closed from us what was happening, like a theatre curtain. The rumble of the tanks grew louder and louder. It made the surface of the water shake. It was the only thing I could catch. When danger finally arrives after hours of waiting, you're relieved. You know that a battle has begun. If the enemy is too strong, it will soon be over. But the worst is the unknown, then the situation becomes unbearable. Even sobbing doesn't help. After spending a few hours or even days in fear, as near Belgorod, you plunge into a real madness. Tears are only the beginning. You vomit and fall unconscious, as if death had already won its battle. So far, I've managed to stay calm. Although the river kept us from escaping, it was still our only hope of escape. I was already knee-deep in the water. The fog hid it from me. I reasoned that if my worst expectations came true, I could try to escape even in the water. I convinced myself that I could do it. Then a light appeared and grenades exploded. 5 or 6 gasping soldiers rushed into the water. It's all those asshole artillery's fault. They lured a van here. The engines couldn't be heard. They were drowned out by screams so long that my blood froze in my veins. Jesus Christ, someone said. The gunshots and explosions came closer and closer. Each one was followed by a scream. People appeared from somewhere in the mist and disappeared into the dark mass of water. A splash told us that they were trying to swim. We froze with fear. A meter away from us passed a column of tanks. It shook the ground and the water. A searchlight cut through the fog. We could not see where they were going, but we realized that they were about to reach us. In those moments of desperate fear, we clung to each other like children. I plunged into the water, and when I came out I could see nothing but tall grass and the riverbank. Very close by came the sound of machine gun fire and the rustling of tank tracks. One of those armoured monsters was tearing up the bank, turning the crowd paralyzed with fear into a bloody mess. 2 searchlights were looking for more victims. It was dawn. We still stood in the water for a long time and did not move, despite the fact that literally drowned in mud and sludge. German artillery was firing from the other side of the river. This is what forced the Russian tanks to roll straight towards us, dooming many German soldiers to death. We were forced out of the shelter by cries for help. We went to see what we could do to help the dying. However, on the shore was going on that could not be imagined. We had to shoot the dying to end their suffering, although such killing was strictly forbidden. As dawn broke, the fog cleared. The sun shone brightly. A new day came, and with it another day of suffering. So we quickly organized the funeral parties. They set to work, writhing in disgust. Those who escaped the duty tried to sleep or keep warm. My clothes were almost dry, but stiffened. I had not yet recovered from my illness and had not even thought of undressing to wash myself in the river. As if in a dream, I looked at my grey-green uniform. It had taken on a yellow tint. As soon as I fell asleep, I was immediately awakened by screams. I opened my eyes and stared up at the vast pale blue sky. There were familiar sounds. Airplanes. I leaned on my elbow. Sleeping soldiers, half asleep, raised their heads and stared up at the sky. Beside me came the rumble of a powerful machine gun. We struggled to shake off our stupor. 1,000 meters above us circled 4 Russian planes. "Do you want to die without a fight?" shouted to us a lieutenant in rags. "At least try to defend yourselves." We grabbed our rifles and, with our knees on the ground, waited for the enemy. But the Yaks flew away without firing a single shot. They obviously couldn't be afraid of us. So they ran out of fuel. We breathed a sigh of relief. We all wanted to stretch out on the ground again and continue sleeping. Suddenly, a large-caliber machine gun turned around its axis and started firing. The Russian planes came back and gave short bursts from all their machine guns. The lieutenant shouted at the top of his voice, trying to block out the rumble of the engines. "No, shoot, you scum." The airplanes flew by. I saw the lieutenant fall to the ground, rise again, and, clutching his stomach with one hand, with the other discharged his revolver into the air. His face was contorted with pain, and he fell to his knees. Of all those lying nearby, he was the only one wounded. The planes made their main attack on the overloaded rafts, which were barely moving, and made a convenient target. "Help," shouted a skinny guy. He and his comrade went to see what they could do to relieve the lieutenant's suffering. "He behaved like a real hero," answered one of the field officers. "Only one did that." The guy carried the dying man to the edge of the river. I walked beside him. "Shame has nothing to do with it," he said, sighing heavily. We were not abandoned to our fate. Anti-aircraft guns came from the west bank, and the rafts resumed their perilous voyage. Apparently, they were full of dead and wounded. The planes would descend, fly up to the rafts and open fire, then fly away. Then we would pull our heads off the ground. Those who remained alive on the rafts would jump into the water and try to swim. The airplanes came for the 4th time. This time they were met by the fire of all our guns and machine guns, and the vultures were driven back. One of the Russian planes was shot down. The pilot tried to gain altitude. Behind showed smoke, then the plane went sharply down to the water. The pilot tried to jump out with a parachute, but it didn't open. Both the pilot and the plane went underwater. Our joyful shouts drowned out the groans of the wounded. By noon, the planes returned. Now there were at least a dozen of them. Between raids, we managed to dig trenches. Now we were somehow protected, but we couldn't repel the Air Force. Again and again the Russians attacked the overloaded rafts, even those that almost reached the western shore. We watched in impotent rage as the bombs flew. The rafts with everyone on board were blown to pieces. Our fleet had been eliminated and the attacks had just begun. The Alliés were gaining altitude. The soldier next to me was shouting incessant. "Bastards! Bastards! We can't get out of here. They'll kill us all." And then a miracle happened. There were cheers. Victory! Victory! Luftwaffe! 9 Messerschmitt 109 FS appeared in the sky. They headed toward the Russian planes lined up to attack. The Russian pilots knew that the Messerschmitts outnumbered them and scattered. Machine gun bursts were heard. 2 Ilyushin were shot down. The soldier who a few minutes ago had despaired now shrieked with joy. Our pilots began to pursue the Ilyushin. They were fleeing, flying low over the ground. They disappeared behind the hills and were never seen again. We were left to deal with the wounded. The next day, to our good fortune, it rained. All night long the transportation continued. We managed to move the maximum number of soldiers, but even more remained on the eastern shore. We didn't count how many days we had spent here, but we began to get ourselves in order somehow. Those who belonged to the same units found each other. On the hills, the officers had placed armed sentries to warn of an attack. We knew that the Russians were close at hand and wondered why they had not yet attacked us. Perhaps all their forces were absorbed in the battle for Kiev. I joined a large group consisting of soldiers of the Greater Germany and an infantry regiment that came to our aid when we made a breakthrough near Konotop. The officers nearby, among whom I was pleased to see Captain Vesredo, said that we, soldiers of an elite division, should be the first to go west and would board the very next pontoon. We, of course, rejoiced. Everyone wanted to get to the western shore as quickly as possible. One of the soldiers suggested that we tie a reed with straps and climb across on it like rafts. We might have been able to do this, but then we would have had to abandon our weapons and would have been considered deserters. The officers forbade the building of such rafts, fearing the worst, but they could not control those who had lost their heads from fear. Many took to them. Some drowned, some were shot, and those who swam to the other side were court-martialed. I stopped thinking altogether. Not realizing the situation we were in, I decided to look for old friends among the soldiers of my unit. Maybe I'd come across a Gales, a Lenson, or a veteran. But the search was unsuccessful. No one could tell me anything definite about my friends. I recognized a few soldiers from our company, but they knew nothing. My questions only annoyed them. They had only one thing on their minds, to get across the river by any means necessary. There's only one man left who knows more than the others, Captain Vesredo. But I respected him so much that I didn't dare to talk to him and only tried to keep close to him. One day the captain noticed me. I looked at his tall figure, at his long leather cloak, glistening with raindrops, and prepared to stand at attention. But the captain gestured to stay where he was. "What regiment are you in, young man?" he asked. I gave the numbers of the regiment and the company, in which I got, retreating from Konotop. He thought I was a Czech. I had to tell him my biography. He said. "These companies were the last. I led several of them myself." "I know, Mr. Captain. I got red in the face. I saw you." "That's how it is," said Vesredo. "Then we have something to remember." "That's right, Mr. Captain." He reached for a cigarette, but the pack was empty. Wasn't he going to offer me a cigarette too? "Tomorrow we'll cross the Dnieper. You'll probably get a little vacation." The word vacation sounded unexpected to me. Vacation? I think so. Memories came back to me, which I had already despaired of reviving. I can't believe it's possible. Of course it is. How could I have doubted it? I started to remember Paula again. Since we were constantly on the offensive, we didn't get any mail. I was very worried about the lack of news. And when this hell began, words of love and tenderness lost all meaning. I often thought that if we managed to survive the war, then life itself would be completely different. How can you be upset because of love, disappointment, if you managed to escape from the clutches of death. I did not come to terms with death, and in the most terrible moments I was ready to give anything. Luck, love, even an arm or a leg, for the possibility of staying alive. I realized that Captain Vesredo was about to leave, and asked him if he knew anything about my friends. He only remembered a veteran, giving his full name. August Wiener's company assisted the howitzer battery at the beginning of the offensive. The first detachments had a hard time. In any case, those who fought there were probably sent to Kiev. There we had to regroup. I listened to him in silence. He nodded and stepped back. Tomorrow we have to cross the Dnieper. In my head I mixed the joy of the upcoming vacation and the fear that I had lost my closest friends. Maybe I had already walked over their corpses on the Konotop-Kiev road. Would I have to give up my friends who mean so much to me? Would I have to erase the names of Gals, Lenson and cowardly Lindbergh from my memory without regret? My friends may be gone forever. But I remember the advice given by a veteran. In moments of despair, I will remember all the good things. I lay on the ground, ignoring the downpour, and the water running down my face replaced my tears. It rained for a long time, all night and the next day until the evening. The ground became a swamp. Touching it made us as wet as the rain. We were soaked through, many of us undressed and waited for the ferry. Mostly we stood with our waterproof cloaks over our shoulders and watched the ferries come and go. In spite of the abominable weather, a new squadron of Ilos appeared at noon. Cursing everything in the world, we threw ourselves again into the viscous mud. The planes flew over us 3 times. They bombed and showered us with bullets. The list of dead and wounded grew even longer. As the sun was setting, about 6 o'clock in the evening, the carriers took over our platoon. We were ordered to take our gear and march in formation to the 3 landing points. With weapons and packs the platoon went where directed, nearly drowning in mud. Walking through muddy water with soaked boots, we arrived at the site. Everyone waited patiently for their turn, enduring the pouring rain without complaint. Smiles appeared on our faces. At last we would cross the river and this nightmare would be over. We would dry off, sleep, maybe even get comfortable and forget about the fear. We tried to think of pleasant things, though each of us was worried. How would the overloaded raft sink? And if Russian airplanes appeared? We remembered perfectly well the shooting we had seen the day before. It was getting dark. The Russians rarely flew at night, so we could at least probably escape them at this time. It was my turn. Among 100 soldiers I climbed onto the raft, the planking of which was in complete disrepair from thousands of shoehorned boots. I looked fearfully at the water. It covered him already a few centimetres. "Well, that's enough, Captain," growled the field fellow, who was at least 40. "Are you trying to drown us?" "We must take as many soldiers as possible, Mr. Fieldfell." The sapper laughed. "That's the order, and orders must be obeyed. Come on, 10 more men." We were almost submerged in the water when the sappers released the ropes, and with the ease of young goats jumped on board. The raft was moving through the water. The sappers worked the oars so slowly that we could hardly feel the motion. It seemed that if we moved, we would sink. Gradually, the cursed shore, shrouded in fog, disappeared from sight. I stood in the middle of the ferry, squeezed between 2 military men I did not know. One was a young lieutenant from the infantry regiment that had come to our aid at Konotop. The other was from my company. He slept standing up as he was absolutely indifferent to everything that was going on. The rest of us looked endlessly at the rainy sky. A boat with an outboard motor approached us. It was as full as our raft. How long did the crossing last? Probably a quarter of an hour, but it seemed as if it would never end. The water was passing by slowly, evenly, and its measured splash did not make us feel any better. Maybe seconds, maybe trying to sleep. The sappers announced that we were approaching the western shore. It was the end of our torment. Those in front could already see the shore, shrouded in fog. The blood ran faster in our veins. Soon we will be safe. Hurry, while the sky was still calm. An empty ferry was coming toward the eastern shore. We gave it a gloomy look. The memory made us shiver. We were afraid to move, lest we should sink. Under other circumstances, we would have jumped up and screamed with joy. But now, we've waited so many days, we've been through so much. We're finally saved. 10 meters to go. 5 meters to go. The ferry was approaching the boardwalk. The bomb squad warned us to get off slowly and carefully. feeling over the moon with happiness. We finally stepped on solid ground, or rather in the same mud as on the eastern shore. But what do we care about the mud now? We are on the other side. The West Bank is security, the border that firmly separates us from the Russians. We've waited so long for this moment, we've even forgotten about the war. German troops will hold the Dnieper. The enemy will not cross this border, and in the spring we will push the Russians beyond the Volga. During our terrible retreat and endless waiting, we all believed it. When we reached the Western Bank, we decided that all our suffering was over. Reorganization would begin, we would be given clean clothes and leave. Of course, the West Coast is still Russia, but we've already fought here as victors. The West Bank has become our homeland. The officers and soldiers who were to escort us did not make a pleasant impression on us, and the military gendarmes whose plaques glittered in the fog were altogether disgusting. All organizations have police. Maybe there are some good people among the police, but the police at Romney we would like to forget forever. That's how we walked. We were accompanied by a couple of gendarmes in a dirty motorcycle. They did not make it too difficult for themselves and put us in threes, but let us walk as we were. This departure from custom was pleasing to us. Maybe the gendarmes knew what we had been through and decided to give us a break. We managed to get out, and now everything will probably be all right. The motorcycle forced us to go at full speed. We went through the muddy sludge for about 3 kilometers and finally found ourselves in front of a large camp where those who had come here earlier were waiting for us. It was getting dark. It was raining. The barbed wire was covered with moisture. 2 soldiers with machine guns led us into the territory. That's where we stopped. The motorcycles were gone. We huddled in a small area behind the wire and didn't know what to think. We tried to convince ourselves that this is the way it is in the army. The cold reception is explained by our defeat at Konotop. They make us wait to be housed in clean, comfortable barracks, or they prepare our passes. Thinking thus, we forgot about the mud, the downpour, and the barbed wire. We stood like that for 2 hours. Another platoon joined us. The rain was getting heavier. Water was pouring off us in streams. Nearby there were barns with good roofs and glass windows. Groups of 20 men were sent there. We waited our turn. At last all our suffering would come to an end. Those who went to the barracks did not return. After an hour, it was our turn. 20 soldiers, led by 2 field officers, and a lieutenant went into the building. There was a self-contained generator. There was light everywhere. We even felt uncomfortable because we were all covered in mud. In front of us at a long table sat military men of various ranks and gendarmes. An Oberleutnant came up and barked like in the old days in Chemnitz. As he prepare for inspection, prepare your documents and weapons. Such a reception made us feel uncomfortable. Present your papers, the gendarme bellowed again. He was interrogating the lieutenant standing right in front of me. Where's your platoon, Lieutenant? Say, Mr. Gendarme. Some are missing, others are dead. We've had a hard... The gendarme paid no attention to his words as he continued to leaf through his papers. You left your platoon. For a moment, the lieutenant was silent. There was a heavy silence. Is this a court-martial? He asked loudly. I'm asking questions here, Lieutenant. Where is your unit? And Lieutenant and all of us had the feeling that we were trapped. Few of us could give a definite answer to that question. The lieutenant started to explain, but it was all in vain. The gendarmes did not want to understand anything and demanded only an answer to the questions on the question. Besides, the lieutenant did not have the binoculars he was supposed to have. The gendarme was simply amazed. The fact that in front of him stood a miraculously survivor who had lost 10 kilograms of weight did not surprise him. What was missing was the thesis issued to all officers, as well as the map case and the list of the platoon for which the lieutenant was responsible. There was too much missing. An army does not throw away armaments. A German soldier would rather die than throw army property anywhere. The lieutenant was assigned to a punishment battalion and had 3 stripes removed from his buttonholes. He was lucky. He was pitiful to look at. 2 soldiers took him aside. It was my turn. I froze with fear. I took my papers out of my inside pocket. The gendarme looked at them, casting a reproachful glance at me. But my pathetic appearance somewhat softened him. Silently he continued to look at the papers. Fortunately, I joined my unit, so I avoided having to sign any papers. I felt dizzy. My legs felt like absorbent cotton. The gendarme read out a list of items that soldiers were required to have. I laid out everything I had at my disposal. It turned out I was missing 4 items, including a bloody gas mask, and I had deliberately thrown it away. The gendarmes examined them and stamped them. In a panic, I took an idiotic step. To arouse their favour, I pulled 9 unused cartridges out of my ammunition pouch. The gendarme's eyes lit up. He resembled a mountain climber who had reached the summit. "Were you retreating?" "Yes, Mr. Non-Commissioned Officer." "Then why didn't you shoot back?" he shouted. "Yes, sir, Mr. Non-Commissioned Officer." "What do you mean, so true?" "We were ordered to retreat, Mr. Non-Commissioned Officer." "Damn it," he shouted. "What kind of soldiers are these? Fleeing without firing a single shot." The papers went out again. The gendarme who was interrogating me flipped through them, shifting his eyes from the soiled pages to my face. I followed the movement of his lips. Perhaps he would send me to a penal battalion, and then I would be sent to the front line, to demining fields, to a camp where the word freedom lost all meaning, and where correspondence was forbidden. I could hardly hold back my tears. At last the gendarme gave me back my papers and my soldier's book, and thus my freedom. The penalty battalion passed me by. Taking my satchel, I sobbed. The tears showed also at the soldier who was standing next. The crowd looked at me in amazement. Feeling like a complete wretch, I ran outside through the door across the street and joined my comrades. They were standing in the rain at the other end of the camp, not lounging in the soft beds we had dreamed of. The water running down our backs and shoulders confirmed the collapse of our dream. Despite the slap in the face we received from a grateful homeland, we were still lucky. 3 days later, we learned that the very day after we had crossed to the other side, the Russians launched an attack. Perhaps the reason for this was the failure of the operation to capture Kiev, where the tiny German army was fighting desperately. In retaliation, the Russians decided to clear the territories occupied by the Wehrmacht. Within 24 hours, the 6,000 to 7,000 soldiers remaining on the eastern bank were already doomed. Observers in the trenches on the west bank saw hordes of Russian infantry moving toward the river. Panic set in. Many threw themselves into the water. Shells were tearing around. They were destroying our machine guns and light anti-aircraft guns. The Russians, who were driven by the desire to achieve victory at all costs, went forward without regard for losses. Panic was replaced by madness. A crowd rushed to the last departing ferry. Those who managed to keep calm urged not to despair. Even guns had to be used. The raft unmoored and travelled a few meters, barely holding on under the weight of the mass of people. Those who tried to grasp the raft were hit by heavy boots. And on the quay, soldiers fought for every floating vehicle. Many were committing suicide. The raft went a few more meters and began to sink. Screams of terror mingled with the roar of battle. 2,000 soldiers were in the water, scared to death. Some clung to others and drowned their comrades. At that moment, from the top of the hill began to descend troops of the Russians, crushed our defences. Intoxicated with success, they went down to the water and began shooting the Germans like targets in a shooting gallery. Some soldiers tried to shoot back, but they were so few that the Russians paid no attention to them. The rest were running, screaming, throwing themselves into the water, dying. The Russians lit up the darkness with rockets and shot at anyone who floated on the water. In an hour, the Russian troops had completely seized the coast. A third of the remnants of the German troops were captured, and for the rest, the war was over forever. At least they wouldn't be bullied by the gendarmes. We stood in the rain for a while longer. 3 trucks appeared and the loading began. Each one was filled with up to 50 soldiers with full uniforms. The night was quiet. I couldn't figure out where we were going. After an hour, we found ourselves at buildings barely recognizable in the darkness. The whole square in front of them was packed with cars. Troops were everywhere. Infantrymen, motorcyclists, officers, military gendarmes. The trucks slowed down and we started to get out. I was terribly hungry and sleepy, but we had to wait. The rain didn't stop. I wonder if it rains everywhere. Is it raining in France? I was reminded of my home. Where is it now? It's all in the past. My present world is the vast Russia that has swallowed us all up. Finally, an officer approached us. The commander peddled documents to him, and he looked through them by flashlight. Then he ordered us to pack up and follow him. Finally, we were under the roof and stared joyfully at the ceiling as if we were in the Sistine Chapel. "Later you will be sent to your units," said the field officer. He was as fed up with everything as we were. For now, rest. He didn't have to repeat his advice twice. With flashlights, we looked around the hut. We found several benches and 4 or 5 large tables. Everyone had made themselves comfortable. The lowest leg, belly, or boot served as a cushion. We didn't care about comfort. The most important thing is that it's dry. Someone snored right away. We were not received too kindly, but we hoped things would go well from now on. We thought we'd probably get a vacation. We'll just have to wait. But soldiers don't have the luxury of dreaming. The lack of sleep made my temples pound with an iron hammer, and soon we were all in a deep sleep. We must have slept like that for a long time. We were awakened by a long whistle, the signal to rise. The sun was already shining. We got up, dirty and wrinkled. If the Führer had seen us, he'd have sent us home. Or to the firing squad? The officer who woke us up looked at the new arrivals with curiosity. He couldn't imagine German soldiers in such a state. He started to explain something, but I didn't listen to him. I was not awake yet and understood only that he was saying some words. We must get ready for departure. We are going back to our units. There was a shower room in one of the huts, but it became clear that we would not be able to get there in time. Instead, we were given gasoline cans with hot water. But we were so tired that we did not want to wash. Not even a tiny spot on our uniforms had terrified us. Now it was all in the past. Hygiene was no longer of concern to us. There were more important things to worry about. Besides, the cold was terrible, and we did not want to take off anything, not even the sackcloth hanging from our shoulders. The cold made me shiver. I wondered if I would get sick again. We went outside and lined up in front of the field kitchen. From the outside, it looked like some kind of a gathering of homeless people. The wind carried a wet mist from the river. The cooks tipped large portions of hot soup into our unwashed woks. We waited for the barley coffee we had grown accustomed to, but it seemed that those times were far in the past. As a gesture of gratitude, we were at least given soup. The scalding mixture made us feel much better. The captain passed by. He glared at us. The lieutenant acting as team leader went to him. "Lieutenant," said the captain, "your soldiers have been given a chance to wash up. I don't think we should neglect it." "Yes, Mr. Captain." The lieutenant ordered us to go to the showers, cisterns, which were under the vaults of one hut. We looked enviously at the lucky ones coming to the water. There were at least 300 soldiers waiting in line. Those who were in front had managed to take off some of their clothes. They were looking for lice lodged at belt level when the order to depart immediately sounded. I was glad. To undress in this cold, no way. I'd rather let my lice bask between my grey sweatshirt and my stomach, which was rumbling with hunger. I was sick again. That's right. I was shaking like a fever. My legs were stiff. We piled into the cars. As usual, each one was packed to the brim, but nobody complained. It was better than walking. I'd rather stay in camp, though. The trucks started down the road, which had been muddied by the rains to the point of mire. Huddles of slurry splashed from under the wheels like water in a city fountain. I remembered the retreat from the Don. Is the whole of Russia a giant swamp? We crawled northward, where dense forests stretched. The wind carried rare explosions. There must have been fighting somewhere. Dark clouds covered the sky. It would rain again soon. Squeezed between 2 travelling companions, I bounced on every bump. I was getting worse and worse. My lips and face were burning. Every now and then I felt sick to my stomach. At first I thought that it was the consequences of the experience. I had not recovered from the disease that happened to me near Konotop. Now perhaps I resembled a living corpse. My intestines were tied in knots. Nobody cared about me, of course, and I'm not the only one with a rumbling in my stomach. The pain became so intense that I bent double, despite the load. A bearded soldier sitting next to me noticed my condition and said, "Hold on, boy. We'll be there soon." He knew no more about where we were going than I did. I've got a stomachache." "I know, but you'll have to bear it." Suddenly I realized what was wrong with me. Diarrhea. But I'm not going to stop a military convoy because of me. What a situation. We get to the place and what? We run straight into the bushes. They'd probably shoot me as a deserter. But I couldn't hold back much longer. I tried to think of other things, but it was in vain. I was covered with sweat. Finally, my insides opened. "Move over, buddy," I whispered, writhing. "I've got diarrhea. I can't take it anymore." The truck rumbled. No one seemed to hear me. I shrugged my shoulders and tried to pull my pants down. What's the rush? Asked the neighbour I'd shoved off. You'll be fine when we get there. But I'm sick, damn it. He mumbled something to himself and moved his leg, though it was impossible to put it anywhere else. No one cared what was happening to me. I fought desperately with my overcoat, with my pants, but it was impossible to even turn around, and I was in full battle dress. I realized I was powerless and gave up. The slurry ran down my legs. My stomach twisted with pain again. I slipped into prostration. I was burning up. Chronic dysentery has haunted me ever since. Our trip continued for a long time, and I had 2 more bouts of diarrhea. Although I didn't get much dirtier, I would have gladly traded 10 years of life for a chance to wash up and throw myself into a warm bed. I was shaking from cold to hot, and my stomach ached more and more. It took forever. Finally, we arrived at the new camp, and I got out of the truck. Roll call began. In a semi-fainting state, I tried to stay on my feet, although fainting would have gotten me to the hospital quicker than anything else. Each of the comrades was preoccupied with himself, but my terrible appearance drew the officer's attention. The usual routine of roll call was interrupted. "What's the matter with you?" the officer asked. "I'm sick. I could barely move my tongue. Instead of the officer, there was only a blurry silhouette in front of my eyes." "What's the pain?" "My stomach. I have a fever. Let me wash up, sir." "Oh, take him to the hospital immediately." The officer turned to the field sergeant. He stepped forward and took my hand. "Someone is trying to help me. It's unbelievable." "Yes, I have diarrhea. I need to wash up," I said as we walked on. "The hospital has everything you need." There were about 30 people in line in front of the hospital. The pain in my intestines made me moan quietly. Soon my intestines would throw out another load. I stepped out of the line, trying not to stagger, and following the signs, headed for the restroom. Once I was done, I didn't put my pants on right away. As dirty as I was, I still noticed blood in the feces. I went back and waited in line for another half hour. Finally, it came to me. I pulled off my rags. "God, what a stench!" the orderly exclaimed. He looked as menacing as the placard on the gate at the camp. "Louse's death." I looked around the long table where the doctors sat like judges. It was useless to deny it. I could only admit my guilt. Bacterial dysentery, one of the doctors grumbled, shocked by the liquid feces streaming down. "Get in the shower, pig," the other said. "We'll do you when you're clean." "That's all I want." "This way," said the first orderly. He was obviously glad to be rid of me. I threw my overcoat over my bony shoulders and went to the showers. Luckily, there was only one strange guy scrubbing the floor. "Is there hot water?" I asked, not hoping for a miracle. "Do you need hot water?" He spoke in a soft, friendly voice. "Why, is there any?" "There is. The 16th Company has 2 cisterns for laundry. I'll bring it over. It's only cold in the shower." Despite the fever, I realized it was another bastard. He wants to do me a favor in exchange for cigarettes or something. "I don't have any cigarettes," I said. "It doesn't matter. I don't smoke," the soldier replied in a friendly tone. I froze in surprise. "That's it. So I can count on hot water?" The soldier nodded. "Yes, then. Come in." He gestured to the shower stall. "You'll be more comfortable there." 2 minutes later, he returned with 2 jugs of boiling water. "Straight from the front?" he asked. I glanced at him. What did he want? The goofy smile never left his face. "From the front. And if you must know, I've had enough. I'm sick." "Yes, the front is terrible. Felfer Belgulf says he'll soon send me to the front line to get shot." Under the shower, I felt incredibly relieved. I looked at the soldier with surprise. "There are plenty of them. They like to send others to their deaths. What did you do before that?" "Hey, I was drafted 3 months ago. I worked for Herr Fechter. Then I went to Poland and joined the Greater Germany." "That sounds familiar," I thought to myself. "And who is this Herr Fechter?" "Him. He's the boss. He's really strict, but he's a good man. I've been working for him since I was a kid." "Your parents sent you to work as a child?" "Hey, I have no parents. Herr Fester took me straight from the orphanage. He has a lot of work on his phone. I've been looking at him. Wow, there are those less fortunate." He kept smiling. I clutched. "What's your name?" "Frosch. Helmut Frosch. Thank you, Frosch. Now I have to go back to the hospital. I was about to leave when I noticed a stocky figure watching us from the doorway. Before I could say a word, the stranger bellowed, "Muddy Frosch." Frosch made a sharp turn and rushed to the damp rag left on the floor. I backed away slowly to get away unnoticed. But the field flea ball was concentrating on Frosch. "No, Frosch, why are you shirking your work?" "I just asked him about the war, that's all." "You're not allowed to talk in the brig, Frosch. You're only allowed to answer my questions." Frosch was about to say something, but there was a clap. I turned around. Bill had just slapped Frosch. I decided to get out of here quickly, and my new acquaintance's head was full of curses. Mastered. I gritted my teeth. At the hospital, the therapist examined me without much enthusiasm. I immediately realized that for him, dealing with filthy ragamuffins like me was a punishment. He groped me and finally put his finger in my mouth to check the condition of my teeth. He wrote something on a card attached to my papers, and I was sent on to the surgeon's desk. There, 5 or 6 orderlies checked my papers. They asked me to remove the clothes I had thrown over my shoulders. Some rude man gave me an injection, and I was sent to the hospital building where the beds for the sick were located. There they looked at my papers again, and then a real miracle happened. I was given a bunk, a chump covered with grey cloth. There were no blankets or sheets, but I found myself on a real bed, in a dry room and under a roof. I threw myself on the bunk. My head ached with fever. I was so used to sleeping on the ground that there was no way I could adjust to the soft, clean mattress. There were several other bunks like mine in the room. There were soldiers lying and moaning, but I paid no more attention to them than a guest would to hotel furnishings if they were not to his liking. I took off some of my clothes and covered myself with an overcoat and a sheet instead of a blanket. I lay like that for a long time and tried not to think about the pain in my stomach. Some time passed. 2 orderlies appeared. Without saying a word, they pulled the blanket off me. "Roll over, buddy, and get your ass over here. Let's clean out your bowels." Before I realized what was happening, they gave me an enema and went on to the next patient. My bowels were spilling several liters of water. I don't know much about medicine, but it has always amazed me how someone who suffers from diarrhea can be given an enema. Anyway, after this operation was repeated twice more, my suffering increased. All I did was to go to the restroom, which was some distance from the hospital. I had to wade through freezing gusts of wind, so maybe staying in bed would have helped me, but that kind of walking was a total waste. 2 days later, I was declared convalescent and sent back to my company, though I could hardly drag my feet. My company was very near, about 10 kilometers from the division headquarters, in a tiny village, from which half of the inhabitants had left. I was terribly glad to see my friends again. And everyone was there, including Olensheim. But my condition was no better than when I arrived at the hospital. My closest friends, Gals, Lenson, and the veteran were fussing around me, trying to help me in any way they could. They were especially insistent that I pour as much vodka down my throat as possible. This, they said, was the only remedy. However, I visited the toilet more and more often. The sight of my bloody feces worried the veteran who accompanied me in case I fainted. At the insistence of my friends, I tried twice to make my way to the hospital, but it was full of wounded from near Kiev, and my papers indicated that I had recovered. I became quite ill. I did not get up from the bed. My friends carried guard duty for me several times and performed other tasks. In the company, which was still commanded by Vesredo, everything was going well, but we remained in the area of military operations, which means that at any minute we could go to the positions. Vesredo realized that I would not be able to last in combat conditions. One evening, a week after I was discharged from the hospital, I began to have delusions. I didn't realize there was a bloody battle going on in the sky. On the other hand, you were lucky Gales joked. He dared to talk to Vesredo about me. The latter explained to him, "My boy, we are withdrawing our troops shortly. We are being transferred to the occupation zone, 100 kilometers to the west. Of course, we will have a lot of work to do there too, but compared to the present time, it will be a vacation. Ask your friend to hold out for another 24 hours. And tell everyone we're leaving, we'll all feel better soon." Gales clicked his heels and flew out of the headquarters like a hurricane. He looked into every hut. He saw and spread the happy news. When he reached us, he roused me from unconsciousness. "Sayer, you're saved," shouted. "Soon we will be leaving. A real vacation awaits us. He turned to the soldiers who lived in the hut with us. We should give him more quinine. The boy needs to hold out for another 24 hours. As weak as I was, Gail's cheerful mood rubbed off on me. You're saved. You kept repeating. You understand? With such a fever, you'll probably be sent to the hospital and then still give leave. How lucky you are. Every movement made my stomach churn. Despite that, I started packing. Everyone around me was doing the same thing. Closer put a bundle of letters. The division letter carriers gave me a lot of correspondence. There were at least a dozen letters from Paula, which greatly relieved my suffering. I also heard from my parents. They reproached me for my long silence. Even Frau Newbach wrote. Overpowering myself, I answered them all, though I must have written incoherently because of the fever. Finally, we set off. I was given a place in the truck auto union, and we travelled along the roads of the Carolingian era to Vinnitsa. The cars were almost drowning in potholes filled with rainwater. It even seemed to me that we were driving through the famous Pripyat bogs. They were indeed not far away. We drove around on planks floating in the mud. Surprisingly enough, these board roads, despite the fact that you can't drive fast on them, helped us a lot in rainy weather. We travelled 150 kilometres in 9 hours. It was an abominable weather, cold, snowfall, and rain. But we were not disturbed by the Soviet aviation, which became more active at that time. Upon arrival, I and 6 other soldiers of our company were sent to the hospital. At that time, diarrhea was a common disease. Specialists began to bring me back to health. My friends were 25 kilometres away. I knew that as soon as I recovered, I would join them. The doctors explained to me that the treatment would take longer, as my intestinal flora was badly damaged. It took at least 2 weeks before I was able to eat normally. Every day I put my ass up to the orderly. He put as many holes in it as a pin cushion. I had my temperature taken twice a day, but the thermometer kept showing 38 degrees. The fever wouldn't go away. Winter had begun. I happily watched the snowfall from the window of the warm ward, knew that my friends were out of danger. I had no idea that the situation at the fronts had deteriorated sharply. The newspapers printed only pictures of shining artillerymen who were settling in new positions or settling down to winter apartments. And the articles were full of meaningless words. Twice Gals visited me. He brought the mail. He had managed to carve out a position for himself as assistant letter carrier, and Gals easily excused himself to visit me. He delighted in everything and threw snowballs at me and laughed heartily. He knew no more than I did what our situation was really like. We had no idea that we were about to begin a terrible retreat that would claim many more lives. I had been in the hospital for 3 weeks when I got the news. I was being discharged. The orderly said that the order to release me had already been signed. Somehow I think, he said, that you will get better at home faster than here. I only replied that I thought so too, though I was ready to throw myself on his neck. As a result, I was given a 10-day pass, which would take effect as soon as it was stamped. I immediately thought of Berlin and Paula. I'll get permission for her to come to France with me, and if I can't, I'll stay with her in Berlin. Though my strength was not quite restored, I was almost jumping for joy. With incredible speed, I packed my things and left the hospital with a big smile. To my friends, I wrote a note apologizing for not stopping by before I left. I knew they wouldn't take offense. Boots polished to a shine left prints in the snow. I walked toward the station. Joy so overwhelmed me that I even spoke to a Russian I met on the way. Gymnastika and uniform were washed and ironed. I felt like a new man and forgot about my previous sufferings. They held great gratitude to Germany and personally to the Führer. They had made me appreciate a clean bed, a roof over my head, and friends who cared for you in a new way. Happiness came over me. I even felt ashamed of my fear and despair. I remembered the past when I was still living in France and the times when life had seemed like torture. Nothing would make me sad now. Only if Paula says she's not interested in me. I was cured of my fears. When the battle became particularly dangerous, I asked the Almighty to forgive me for the wild thoughts I had in my head, but I was willing to pay the price to stay alive. The war had turned me into an unfeeling animal. I was 3 months away from turning 18, and I felt 35 years old. I had many of the pleasures of life back, but there was nothing more important than the desire to stay alive at all costs. I'm horrified to think how monotonous life is in peacetime. In times of war, everyone wants peace. but you can't wish for war to break out in times of peace. The railroad station was located at the edge of a dead end. In front of the lawn, which replaced the platform, there were 3 wide Russian tracks, which passed behind the station into 2. The third track stopped after 500 meters. It was unclear why. The snow muffled any sounds. Broken wagons and empty crates were lying everywhere. Near the main building of the station, a whole mountain of crates with the inscription was piled up. A few Russian railroad workers were sitting by the burning stove. There was no sign of a train going in any direction. Only an old station steam locomotive, which had been in service for at least 100 years, was smoking in the distance. I don't remember the name of the place. Maybe there was no name at all, or maybe the plaque was taken down and thrown away so that we Europeans wouldn't stumble upon these letters that we can't make out anyway. The arrival of the train seemed as distant an event as the coming of spring. The vacation certificate in my pocket warmed me better than any stove. But I was alone in this vast country. Not thinking long, I went to the station building. A Russian railroader was lazily strolling near the door. I knew that we would not find common ground with him, even if he spoke German. But someone must notice me and let me know when the train was coming. I pressed my nose against the glass and noticed 4 railroad workers in the room and a grey-haired soldier sitting next to them. I risked not to believe my eyes. A rich soldier was dozing next to citizens of occupied Russia. I sharply opened the door and entered the room. The heated air burned my cheeks. I clicked my heels with all my might, and the sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. The Russians opened their eyes and slowly stood up. My compatriot only moved his leg. He was at least. "What can I do for you, buddy?" The soldier asked. It was the tone of a shopkeeper talking to a rich customer. I continued to stand there, unable to recover from what I had seen. "I would like to know," I said, pretending to be a real German. "When is the train going home?" "I'm going home on vacation." The soldier smiled and slowly stood up. Holding onto the table, as if he had rheumatism, he approached me. "So you're going on vacation?" He could barely contain his laughter. "You've chosen a good time for a vacation. When is the train coming?" I tried to steer the conversation in the right direction. "You have a strange accent. Where were you born?" I felt myself blushing. "I have relatives in France." I was ready to ram it down his throat. "My father, well, I grew up in France, but I've been in the German army for 2 years now." "No. So you're French?" "No. My mother is German." "In such cases, it's the father that counts." "Look at this," he said to the railroad workers, who had no idea what he was talking about. They even took the French children. "What time will the train arrive?" "You don't have to worry about trains. They come here whenever possible." How come?" "There's no timetable." "What do you want?" "You're not on the German railroads." "But, naturally from time to time trains pass by the station. But when? Who knows?" He smiled. "Sit with us. You have plenty of time." "No, I have no time at all. I've got to get out of here. I'm not going to stay here for nothing." "Think yourself. You can walk down the street and catch a cold. You can go to Vinnitsa. There are more trains from there, but I warn you. You'll have to walk about 60 kilometers through a dense forest full of friends of these guys." He nodded at the railroad workers. "And they are not friends with Adolf and can stop your vacation early." He looked at the Russians and grinned. They smiled back, though they still didn't understand what he was talking about. "Who are you talking about?" I wondered. I sat down. "About partisans, who else?" "Are you saying that there are still these scoundrels here?" Now it was his turn to be surprised. "Where will they go? Romania is full of them. Hungary, Poland. Probably Germany, too. I feel like I've been hit on the head." "Sit down, boy. You don't want to get in the way. It's stupid to get shot at for a few hours. I managed to get some real coffee. It's in the kitchen here, strong and hot. I got a buddy of mine at the commissariat, a great guy. He's sick of it, too. He came back with a big army coffee pot. All we do here is blow coffee." He looked at the Russians. They kept smiling. It made me a little uncomfortable. "What are you guys doing here?" "What I'm doing," he repeated irritably. "Guarding this pile." He pointed to the crates outside. "And these poor people. What do they take me for? I'm 60 years old and they want me to play sentry. For 30 years I worked on the railroads in Prussia and Germany, and this is how they thanked me. Specialization is what we need. Give everyone their place, organize everything properly. Sieg Heil. I'm sick to death of all this. By the end of his tirade, he was shouting and threw the cup on the saucer with all his might. The scene was like a Parisian bistro. I felt like the world was turning upside down. The coffee pot is army property. And you took it without authorization, I persisted. The soldier looked at me and slowly set down the cup he'd just filled with the steaming liquid. Then he handed it to me. Here, taste it. There was silence for a few seconds. Then the soldier spoke again, this time calmly and seriously. Listen to me, my boy. I am 57. From the 14th to the 18th I fought. I was a cavalryman. I was a prisoner of war in Holland for 2 years. It's been 3.5 years since they took me back into the army. I have 3 sons fighting on the fronts our beloved motherland has decided to defend. I'm an old man now. Once I might have cared about politics, but now I care more about this cup of coffee than politics. So have a hot drink and try to forget where you're going for a while. I looked at him in silence. I'm not some kind of field fill or an officer or the Führer. Just an old railroader who had to change his uniform. Sit down, relax. What you're saying is outrageous. Soldiers die for our country every day. And if our country wants something from me, I'm willing to postpone my retirement for a couple more years. But, I'm out of breath. Although I suffered a lot because of the war, I couldn't imagine a different life for myself. I felt like the old soldier was twitching, but I couldn't express my thought. Perhaps I was too young and didn't understand anything. I don't agree with a word you say. I shouted out of anger. If everyone thought like you, everything would be meaningless. For you, such as you, there is no purpose in life. His rifle was lying in the corner of the room. What if your friends took the weapon? I nodded, pointing first at it, then at the Russians. Did it ever occur to you? I thought he was going to throw me out, but he didn't react. Maybe he was afraid. When we're done, I'll take the coffee pot out, he said with a chuckle. Want another? I took the cup, satisfied that I'd set my comrade in arms straight. I'd been waiting here for almost 9 hours. My last hope was gone. But then the train came, and my travelling companions on the train from Vinnytsia to Lvov and Lublin were soldiers who had been in the battles near Cherkasy and Kremenchug. They told me about the terrible battles that were fought near these cities, now occupied by the Russians. Everywhere the numerical superiority of the enemy crushed our positions, which we defended with desperate determination, which did not slow down the number of killed and wounded. Everyone on the train was also going on vacation, but while this pleased them, the fighting that had just taken place had put a stern look on their faces. At dawn the train arrived at the station in Lublin. Snow lay everywhere. The frost in Poland was even more severe than in Russia. Although we were used to sleeping without a roof over our heads, no one slept a wink on the train. In the morning we got up with our collars up and grey faces. In spite of the early hour, there were soldiers crowding the platform, and they paced back and forth to keep warm. From their uniforms and weapons, it was clear. They were being sent to the front. Among the soldiers, judging by the pink youthful faces, there were many recruits. Military gendarmes stood every 10 meters waiting for the trains to arrive. I had overestimated my strength. Obeying an order, I stepped onto the platform and immediately felt weak. My legs bent under. We lined up parallel to the train and walked into the large hall of the station. At that time, the locomotive took the empty train to the spare track. We were each given a cup of scalding barley coffee and some jam. While we drank, the officers climbed a dais equipped with loudspeakers. The gendarmes stood below. The amplifier clicked and hissed. A nasally voice sounded. We heard words that sounded like a slap in the face. Vacation cancelled. We thought we had misunderstood him. But he kept talking. Emergency duty, make every effort. Victory. And we realized we were awake. There was a murmur in our ranks. Many did not hide their indignation. But the loudspeakers were already blaring the march. The hopes and plans of several thousand people had gone to hell. The music was blaring. The jam we had just swallowed was tasteless and the coffee was disgusting. Before we could feel sorry for ourselves, the gendarmes had already chased us to the train ready to leave for the east. 3 wagons were loaded with provisions. We were ordered to line up behind them. We did not try to hide our disappointment and desire to escape, so the gendarmes did not move a step away from us. We were given fur hats, like those that Russian soldiers wore on their heads. made of sheep's wool turned outward, cotton gloves with a woolen lining, and huge oversized overshoes. In addition, each received several cans of canned food. The doubts were put to rest. We were being sent to spend another winter in Russia. Many were ready to burst into tears. The train was packed to capacity. There were boys who had never been in combat, veterans returning from vacation who felt no happier than we did, and those who had to give up even the thought of vacation. We took a long train ride and only gradually realized what had happened to us. I remembered the feelings that had overwhelmed me in Magdeburg when I learned that I would not be allowed to get home. And this time I didn't even get to go to Berlin and see Paula. As I thought about what had happened, I felt more and more gloomy. I had a small hope of getting to the regiment and getting a piece of paper saying that I was a convalescent. I should have explained this to the gendarme. What's the use? It's useless to talk to them. I must go back to my company, and Vesredo will arrange everything there. The trains to the front were moving at top speed, as usual. Not like the trains to the west, which stood for long periods without any apparent reason. Our train was no exception, but an emergency interrupted our journey. The locomotive was rushing at full speed towards Vinnytsia, the arrows with the names of the cities that were now impossible to get to. Konotop, Kursk, Kharkov. It was a quarter of an hour after departure when the train suddenly slowed down, so sharply that it almost went off the rails. We were thrown to the floor. There was swearing. Soldiers in long overcoats ran along the railroad track and answered questions. You are still lucky that we stopped you. The 500 meters to the east, a track in the middle of a wooded area was blocked by overturned cars. We crawled out to find out what had happened and heard muffled voices. Guerrilla Sadzin dated train loaded with explosives. 150 soldiers killed, revenge at detachments, pursuit. Those of the soldiers who were not injured began to dismantle the rubble. We helped the wounded. It turns out that the partisans, having destroyed the track, also opened fire on those who tried to get out of the burning cars. Officers whistled, gathering people. At least 3,000 soldiers crawled out of our train. We were divided into 3 squads. The largest went in pursuit of the enemy. I was in that squad. The second was sent to help the wounded, and the third was left to protect the train. My belongings were left in the wagons. On the whistle we went into the forest, wading through deep snowdrifts. Walking through snowdrifts is not as easy as it looks. After 10 minutes, you're covered in sweat. 20 minutes later, you're out of breath. After an hour, your lungs stop working and your eyes start to double. The frost was a little cold, and from gymnastic exercises we all covered with sweat. The officers got tired of running at full speed. They ordered us to take a normal step. In an hour and a half we reached a large village. Thatched roofs covered the huts. Nearby stood barns woven from branches. By the time we arrived, the village was swarming with German soldiers. In the main square the inhabitants, men, women, and children, were crowded together. They were gesticulating and discussing something loudly. Around them stood soldiers. Many held their weapons at the ready. In the middle of the square, another squad was pushing some of the peasants aside. To the right, in the house where the village chief apparently lived, a third squad stood, pointing rifles at the Russians who were lying on their stomachs right in the snow. I even thought at first that they were dead. Partisans, explained to me the soldier standing next to me. They caught them here. Were they really guilty, or were they only suspected? The interrogation lasted at least an hour. The Russians, sprawled on the frozen ground, must have frozen all their guts. But so did our machine gunners. The squad pursuing the partisans included an SS platoon. Their attention was probably attracted by the patches with the inscription Great Germany. The SS preferred to deal with soldiers of elite divisions. And without explaining anything, we were loaded onto SS trucks. What became of those who were lying on the ground, we never learned. For about 20 minutes we drove through mountainous terrain, and then we were dropped off. An SS captain dressed in a long leather coat made a short speech. You will go to the right, into the forest, taking all precautions. You can't see from here, but about 1.5 kilometers to the west is a factory. The Russian informants accompanying us say that there is a partisan center there. We must attack the guerrillas unexpectedly and kill them. The captain appointed the squad leaders. We're on our way. Yes, I'm recovering well. It would have been better if I'd stayed in the hospital in Vinnytsia. A little time passed, and we saw the metal roofs of the factory the captain was talking about. But we had no time to see them properly, as a machine gun burst. "Got you, you bastard, surrender or you'll regret it," shouted the SS man. And a few more shots rang out. Then we heard the clicks of Russian machine guns. The soldier and I threw ourselves under the tree. Its branches were almost touching the ground under the weight of the snow. Missiles called for us to start the attack, but I decided to wait in place. It was foolish to get shot by a bunch of partisans. The guy lying next to me whispered to me, "Got you, you bastards. They won't get away this time. We'll show them how to blow up trains." After a 5-minute battle, the SS took 10 more Russians prisoner. Some of them were brave and sang songs, but mostly they begged for mercy. 30 SS men chased them to the truck, beating them with rifle butts and asking questions. We thought it was all over, but then the captain's whistle blew again. "Those bastards," he pointed to the Russians, "say there's no one here but them. They thought they could outsmart us, protect their buddies who were hiding in the building. I'm ordering a sweep." He pointed to the factory buildings. "We should take them all, along with their weapons." There was no arguing, of course. With dry mouths, we moved into the factory buildings where snipers could be hiding. The fact that our squad was large meant nothing. We might defeat the partisans, but every bullet they fired would hit somewhere. Even if I'm the only one wounded in an army of millions, I don't care about the victory. It is common to be proud of a small number of killed, but those who died, it does not make it easier. Only Adolf Hitler said something good about it. Even a victorious army must count its sacrifices. What could a factory in the middle of nowhere produce? Could it be a sawmill? In the first building there was a large sawmill, and then there were several more. We saw an excavator with dirty buckets. No one in the first 2 buildings. Maybe the partisans weren't lying. But we were ordered to inspect everything. The squad surrounded the factory buildings and then began to tighten the ring, moving toward the center. We passed several huge barns that looked like they were about to collapse. They stood unpainted, their iron parts eaten away by rust like an old harbor anchor. The wind was picking up. The sheds creaked. And there was silence all around, broken only by the metallic sound of objects overturned by the SS. 8 men entered the building in which something clicked. There were no windows, which meant it was pitch dark. Every gust of wind moved the tiles and loose boards. In theory, everyone knew that every minute could be the last, but in practice, no one took precautions. It looked like the SS had cornered some Russians outside. Shots, shouts, and stomping feet reached us. Suddenly, the darkness was torn by grenades thrown from the top floor or from a closet. Immediately, the wounded groaned. A second later, 2 fell to the dusty floor, and 2 waddled toward the open door. The others scrambled for cover, but it was not easy in the darkness. More shots rang out. 2 more soldiers screamed to my right. I could barely hold my rifle. The bullet pierced the butt and just miraculously did not hit me. The soldiers who went to the door were wounded a second time. The soldiers outside came running to us, but they did not dare to enter. They stopped at the threshold and fired a few shots that would have hit us rather than the guerrillas. We squealed with all our might. Suddenly some idiot would think of throwing a grenade. Then it would be the end not only of the Russians but also of us. The Russians fired randomly at moving targets. The bullets penetrated the thin walls. For those who stayed outside, they were no less dangerous than for us. I almost died of fear. Was I alone out here? I became even more frightened than at Belgorod. I clenched my lips to the blood not to scream. Outside ours did not retreat. They will achieve that the barn will blow up. Inside, however, the Russians lurked like spiders waiting for prey. From where I was lying, nothing could be seen. Suddenly from behind, somewhere between a heap and a beam, I heard a scraping sound. I froze, taking cover behind a large pipe, and turned my ears to listen. Clearly someone was scraping, louder and louder. I held my breath to the limit and even tried to stop my heart from beating. Horrible assumptions were running through my mind. I imagined myself a prisoner of the guerrillas, a hostage with whom they would escape from the encirclement. Panic seized me in a way I had never experienced before. It was replaced by a passionate desire to survive at all costs, shivering with fear and rage. I felt terrible loneliness and despair, but I decided to fight to the last. Suddenly a man appeared about 5 meters away. Behind him came another. He was crawling toward the piled sacks. Both of them were in the shadows, but I could see their civilian clothes. The first of them wore a large hat. His figure was forever imprinted on my memory. He stood still for a moment, staring into the darkness. Then he took a few steps away from me. I slowly and quietly raised my rifle and pointed it at him. I had only one bullet left, and I didn't have to open the bolt. If I made the slightest noise, I would be finished. Fortunately, there was noise outside, distracting the guerrilla's attention. I took aim. My finger was on the trigger. I hesitated for a moment. It is hard to shoot a man in cold blood unless, of course, you are completely heartless or have lost your head from fear, and he moved slowly toward me. His companion was nowhere to be seen. He was probably walking about 20 meters away from us. I could hear the breathing of the man approaching me. Maybe he thought he saw someone lurking in the shadows. Maybe he recognized the glint of a rifle. For a tenth of a second he hesitated. Then I fired and he fell into the mud. The second Russian ran away, leaving his comrade lying at my feet. And then panic seized me. It seemed that I was falling into the abyss. I was torn by a contradictory desire. I wanted to run, but fear paralyzed my whole body. I looked at the corpse lying face down in front of me. I couldn't believe that I had killed him. I waited for the blood to show on the ground. Nothing else seemed important. I was just overwhelmed. Suddenly, part of the wall collapsed. In the light of day, it didn't seem so tragic anymore. At the sight of German soldiers entering the barn, I came out of my lethargy. I even recognized an SS captain among them. He was facing me about 20 meters away. "Lord, is anyone alive?" he shouted. I raised my hand and he saw me. I did not forget that there was another Russian hiding somewhere in the hangar, so I did not want to draw attention to myself. From somewhere came the shout of a second German soldier, frightened. "Here, friends. I have a wounded man here." "Don't move," replied the captain, "until we clear the barn from the Russians." He noticed a corpse lying at my feet. There was the sound of the engine. It got louder and louder. From my hiding place I saw an armoured personnel carrier crawling through the snow. A second later it punched a hole in the wall. A machine gun was hanging from the hull. The hangar was illuminated by the beam of a powerful searchlight. The soldiers riding on the armour raised their rifles. The beam of light hit me for a second, and a chill ran down my spine. How frightened the faces of the Russians. How frightened they must be. Through the doorway I could see the remnants of our detachment. The captain shouted, "Surrender before we kill you all." There was no reply. Then from the barely lighted rafters came shouts. A powerful machine gun rang out. It seemed that each shot would blow the hangar to pieces. Explosive bullets left holes in the roof, through which the light penetrated. The German soldiers gathered outside were firing at the rafters, behind which at least 15 guerrillas were hiding. I crouched on the floor and put my hands over my ears to keep from going deaf. A Russian machine gun rang out overhead. Someone screamed in a way that froze the blood in my veins, and someone's body fell to the floor. The machine gun managed to blow off the rest of the roof. Light burst into the hangar. Now the partisans would definitely not get away. Another Russian fell to the floor, the rest tried to run, but in the end they all died. This was how we avenged the deaths of the German soldiers on the train. The shed was filled with German soldiers. I was able to get out of the shelter covered in mud. There were pieces of wood stuck between my belt and overcoat. We went back to the village, billowing a song. "This is my land. This is my homeland." We had won, and no one could judge us. The SS loaded the prisoners into their cars and drove down the road we had taken to get here. We were ordered to follow in threes. By the time we reached the village, the crowd that had seen us go to the factory had already dispersed. The SS gave each of us a certificate explaining the circumstances under which we had been delayed in arriving. We were ordered to return to the train. We were not sorry to leave. The last scene we saw was not a pleasant one. The team, outfitted for the firing squad, went about their business. 4 shots rang out and the 4 partisans were finished. They fell to the snow. We were silent. The officer explained to us. At least 100 of our soldiers were killed in the sabotage. The partisans are to blame for everything that happened. Besides, how can you compare a partisan and a man in a German uniform? They must be shot without trial one way or another. Such are the laws of wartime. We spent the night in the train, standing motionless. It was with great difficulty that I managed to sleep. As soon as I closed my eyes, a nightmare came over me. A huge stone appeared in front of me, and dark blood trickled down from below. It got on my feet and burned them. The next day, the frost got worse. We boarded another train that came to pick us up and listened to the monotonous tapping of the wheels. The forests ran by, immersed in snowdrifts. Only occasionally the monotonous picture was broken by lonely pines standing on the hills. The vast spaces where no man had ever set foot, as if created for giants, made us uncertain again. Would anyone be able to subdue this country? In the evening we arrived in Vinnitsa. The traffic was disorderly because of the air raid that had begun. The station was crowded with soldiers in long winter overcoats. Part of the Great Germany Division was based in Vinnitsa at this time, so the gendarmes sent me directly to the command post. The organization that reigned in the division pleasantly surprised me. As soon as I gave my name and company number, I was immediately given the location of the unit. With horror I heard that we returned to the front line and together with 20 other companies occupied the area 500 kilometers from Vinnitsa. I was given the district and the number of the sector, and I thought how I would meet my friends and tell them about the cancelled vacation and how we would figure out how to restore it. Instead, we'd meet in an icy trench. It hit me like a shoe. Confused by what I had heard, I stood in front of the staff Feldfeldbell who had found my name in the lists. He would not have paid any attention to me if my behaviour had not made him speak. What else? Are you ill? The shock was so great that I told him the truth. I went on leave, on recuperation Herr Stabsfeldfil, and in Lublin I learned that it had been. Our homeland is having a hard time, he replied, after a moment's silence. You are not the only one who has been deprived of a well-deserved vacation. Those who were here before you are in the same situation, and those who will be here later. I wanted to add that I was officially entitled to a vacation, but the staff Feldfeldbell came across a certificate issued by the SS captain. I see that you distinguished yourself in the battle with the partisans, he said. Congratulations. I will include the certificate in your file, and the company commander will certainly give you a promotion. As sad as I was, I still smiled. I am very glad, Mr. Staffelfeefbell. I squeezed out of myself half sincerely, half officially. And I'm happy for you. He extended his hand to me. I found myself in the company of 30 soldiers who had suffered the same fate. But we spent the night in a warm, comfortable building that had been converted into barracks. There were not enough beds for all, but every room was heated and the floor was warm. Despite the anxious forebodings, we had a good night's sleep. We had long ago learned to fall asleep when we had to wait for a chance. It allowed us to distract ourselves from heavy thoughts and pass into unconsciousness. Why think when the cats were already scratching at our souls? We stopped thinking about the present and our strength was restored. It was a pity that we couldn't sleep in advance, in case sleep would be impossible. The rest of the evening and the whole next day we spent in sleep, interrupted only by food. It was an officer who brought us out of our slumber. In the evening he ordered us to take the trucks to go to our positions, squirming as if we were under a shower of cold water. We went outside. Roll call was taken, and we took our places in the trucks. It was not yet dawn, and we had already arrived at the village built by the sappers. We were ordered to get out of the trucks. Each was given a portion of barley coffee, which was constantly heated in 3 cubes. It was terribly cold. How our memories of the previous winter came to life. How we woke up from the cold, how it was impossible to wash, lice in short, what torture it was. Everything around us reminded us of the war. The craters told us that there were constant artillery attacks, so the sector was not under our control. 50 men had to join their platoons, which were separated from each other by 50 to 60 kilometers. We were divided into 4 groups. Each was given the mail and supplies requested by the companies, shown where to go, and the officer cheerfully announced that we had a distance of at least 40 kilometers to cover. We set out across the snow-covered valleys. Another kilometer from the assembly point began powerful fortifications, anti-tank guns, minefields, positions for machine guns, and all around a boundless country from which one could expect only trouble. Having passed the last line of fortifications, we realized that we were on the land that belongs to the one who walks on it, which means it can change hands every day. Where the front line was in this section, no one knew. Everywhere one could expect an ambush. Every minute was expected to be a clash with the enemy. A soldier from our platoon was walking with me. He was a new recruit, just a boy, tall and wiry. His eyes, like a gazelle's, were always looking at endless spaces and could not perceive what he saw. He could only see tiny perspectives of Rhineland and could not even imagine that there were horizons that could stretch to infinity. I felt the same way a year ago. After 10 days of snowfall, the weather was sunny and frosty. Gusts of wind exposed strips of land, and we walked on them whenever possible. 5 or 6 airplanes flew by to the south. We froze, trying to determine whose they were. But the planes disappeared in the distance, and we did not even have time to realize whether they were Yaks or Messerschmitt 109s.